everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Hershee Way. Of course, I'm your host, Hershee Love, and I have a guest here by the name of Dr. Meghan Martinez. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi.
So, Dr. Martinez is a professor at my alma mater, Florida State University, and she's also created a class called The History of Caring, which is exactly what you think it is. Exactly what it sounds like, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. So, Dr. Martinez, thank you again for joining me. My first question is, I've seen that you've taught different classes on the same subject about race. How many classes have you taught about this?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I teach at Florida State typically an American history class, which is kind of just general American history from the end of the Civil War till, as far as we get. I teach a class called Race and Ethnicity at Florida State, which is a class that focuses on defining what race and ethnicity is, looking at the ways in which, racism has been built into our country's history and how it still impacts us today, looking at immigration. And then I also created a class that I started teaching last year called Racial Violence in Modern America, Do Black Lives Matter? And the new class that I'm working on currently is the History of Caring. So I usually teach about 3 or 4 different classes, but my field of study, my PhD, is in African American history and specifically racial violence in modern American history. So any class that you take with me, it's something that we're going to talk about. It's really important to me that people understand, that white people understand that Black history is American history. It's not a separate thing. So even if you come into an American history, you should expect to be hearing about the history of Black people, not just as an aside, but as part of, our collective history as Americans. Because if we go back to the colonial period, we think of colonials mostly as like these white British guys, but Black people are there the whole time. And they're there because they were kidnapped and enslaved, but they are here from the beginning of our country. So to me, to talk about American history, if you leave Black history out, you're leaving out a really big and important part of the story, no matter what American history class it is.
And seeing as though you've taught so long about this subject, I want to know, when did you start educating yourself and get interested in this topic in the first place?
Yeah, so I'll try to not make this a long story. But when I started at Florida State, I'm from Miami, Florida, which is, generally considered a pretty diverse place, a big city, and it is. But coming from Miami didn't mean that I understood anything about Black history, Black communities. I grew up around a lot of Cuban people. I went to a school that, there were a lot of Cubans, but I would say they were, white Cubans primarily who I went to school with. And when I came to Florida State, I took a class on actually American literature. And I had a professor, Dr. Stuckey French, who has since passed, rest in peace, Dr. Stuckey French. And he assigned to us Booker T. Washington to read. And I remember reading Booker T. Washington, and, Booker T. Washington was about, kind of self-help. And, basically his advice to Black communities was get jobs, start working, don't worry about liberal arts education, just make money. And when you make money, white people will respect you because you'll show that you're industrious and you can take care of yourself, And I remember reading that at, 19 years old and thinking like, oh, this is a smart man, this is a good idea. And then the very next assignment that professor had us read was W.B. Du Bois. And, Du Bois had a completely different philosophy. He was like, to tell Black people that they're not allowed to have liberal arts education is ridiculous. People are allowed to have and experience the things that they want to experience. And P.S., making money, showing you're industrious is not going to make white people suddenly not be racist anymore. There are a lot of ways we have to engage in this. And I remember it really blew my mind. And I ended up reading the whole book, The Souls of Black Folk, that Du Bois wrote. And it really, I was confronted with my own privilege. I was confronted with the fact that there are things that I'd never thought about before that other people experience in this country that I don't experience because of my skin color, the way that I look. And that really started an exploration for me of confronting my own privilege and trying to figure out, what do I not know? I realized there's so much I didn't know about the history of America and about the racial history of America.
Right.
And that same semester, was reading a Martin Luther King Jr. speech, which was actually about the war in Vietnam. But, you know, people forget that when MLK Jr. was alive, people didn't love him. You know, today people, oh, like he just wanted peace, and we use him to sell car commercials. We use his speeches in car commercials. But when he was alive, he was a divisive figure. And one of the reasons for that was because he spoke out against the war in Vietnam. A lot of people didn't like that. But he basically said, you know, if you're not speaking out, then you're allowing bad things to happen. You know, basically you're part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I want to be part of the solution. So, you know, during my undergrad years, I really refocused from thinking I was going to be an English teacher to deciding that I wanted to study American history, race history specifically, and eventually become a college professor, because it just really, I think when you realize that there's something so big that you've never even thought about before, you know, you can deal with that in a number of ways. You can respond to that in a number of ways. And the way I chose to respond to it was like, I need to know more, and I need to know what my role can be in making the country a better place, rather than, you know, getting away from it and not wanting to confront the reality of, you know, our country and our country's history.
Right. It takes a lot of self-reflection to do that.
You have to be willing to listen, you know,
right,
and,
exactly.
and sometimes it's hard to listen, but it's a really important part of learning about racism, learning about the history of our country, is just being willing to listen, take in new information, and, you know, not take it personally.
Exactly.
All the time, you know, because usually it's not about us as an individual. Usually it's about collective opportunities that are available for some communities and not others.
And so thank you for sharing with us with your history. I also wanted to know, how did you come across the idea of creating the class, The History of Caring? Where were you? What were you thinking about? Like, how did that even come to your mind?
Well, I happen to have a partner who studies, you know, very similar things that I study, which is like, you know, the racial history of our country. Certainly with everything going on in the world right now, you know, it's we talk very often about just what's going on in the news. And then of course with everything that happened with Chris Cooper and Amy Cooper in Central Park. And so we were having this conversation about how, you know, the idea of a white woman using her whiteness to weaponize it against Black men is nothing new, you know, and this term of referring to white women who weaponize their privilege and their whiteness against Black communities, calling them Karen is kind of new, but the idea of who a Karen is very old. So my partner and I were talking about this, and she said, you know, you should do a class about, you know, the history of white women, you know, weaponizing their whiteness against Black communities. And I was like, oh my God, that's like the history of Karen. Like that's what we're calling them now, but they've been around, you know, as long as the country's been around, essentially. Because although, you know, power structures in this country, you know, for the most part, white men are in charge of power structures. They kind of like create these structures. White women have access to that because of their whiteness. You know, it's a conversation where you have to think about intersectionality, obviously, to get it from all angles. So, you know, don't want to lose sight of the fact that white men, you know, definitely have more power in these situations. Usually white women are calling white men to come take care of their problem. But, you know, the complicit nature of white women accessing their whiteness to oppress Black communities, to put Black communities in danger, it's very much a part of the fabric of our country.
Give us a little peek about what the process is like in coming up with an idea for a new class and trying to get that. I'm assuming you'd have to get the course approved by someone, right? For it to become official.
Yes, so right now we're in the process of creating the class. Now the good thing about Florida State and the history department and in women's studies, because this is a class I'm actually creating for women's studies, although it'll be historical in nature, it'll be through the women's studies department, is, you know, it's typically very easy for us to create classes. They are very encouraging to professors to come up with ideas, innovative ideas, interesting ideas. So sort of going through that process is typically not a difficult process to go through. the primary, part of it that you have to work on is just creating the class. And creating a college class is a lot like writing a book. You have to start, you do the research, you lay it out, you figure out the assignments. So that's kind of the bulk of the part of the process we're in right now, is just creating the content for the course. We have a good idea of what it's going to look like. We put a syllabus up, we're going to stick to that. But really at this point, I just need to delve into research to make sure I have content for every day of the week. And that's really the fun part. And the goal with this class is to create the class and then also write the book, because from at least the information I'm getting online, I think there's a lot of people who are interested in this who won't have the opportunity to sit in my class.
Nope.
So I also want to write the book, and I want the book to be something accessible. It's not going to be a history book that's like for academics. It's going to be something accessible. So like, even if you hated history, it'll be something readable that will give you, I think, valuable information to contextualize where we are right now. With this specific moment in history and this use of the term Karen, I think it'll give context and like how we got here, why this matters, and why it matters to talk about, the ways in which white women have this privilege and the ways in which they've used it against Black communities. I think it's really important for us to confront that and be honest about it. And, I'm Cuban, but I'm a white Cuban, as a white woman myself, I think one of my responsibilities in the work to be anti-racist is to like gather together other white women and be like, listen, like it's, it shouldn't, the onus should not always be on Black people to tell white people what they're doing wrong or what the history is. I think like that's part of my responsibility as well. So I want to use my place of privilege. I want to use my background as an academic to try to share this message with other white women, to educate them and hopefully, move us into a better place as a country.
Awesome. Are there going to be any like unique assignments that you're going to have for the class, or is it going to be really just reading whatever readings you have and, assigning the assignments or taking tests?
I think I definitely need to think about this, because I think there's a number of ways to approach it, but I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to go or the interest to go, but in Montgomery, we have a lynching museum there. And it is, our first lynching museum in the United States. My background in racial violence, specifically, I study lynchings primarily in Florida. So you can go to this memorial. There's a memorial and a museum. They're both incredible. Brian Stevenson is the person who got all the funding for this and runs both the museum and the memorial. But if you walk through that lynching memorial, what they've done is they put up plaques that talk about why individuals were lynched. And there's a high percentage of those that say a white woman accused him of this, a white woman accused him of this, a white woman accused her of this, because of course Black women were lynched as well. And so I think one of the ideas would be to, have my students research those instances, say like, here's an instance where a white woman said that this Black man was bothering her. That's it. That might be all it said. Or in one instance, that a white woman told a Black man to go get her something from the store and he refused. Now we're talking about the 1920s. We're not talking about an enslaved person, a free man. She tells him to go do something. He says no, and he ends up being lynched for that. I think having my students look into these situations and do research on these individual events to really show them what we're talking about, that when we use the term Karen, it is kind of funny. You think about like the haircut. I think Karen is really associated with like a feeling of entitlement. Sometimes that might simply mean a white woman sending her food back to the kitchen or something simple. But my class is about the real stakes, the real violent stakes, when people's lives are put on the line because of that entitlement. So I think having students look into these instances and really do the research there might be, illuminating for them to really see the power that these women had. And again, they're also using men. They're telling the men to come handle this for them. So ultimately, white men are the ones still in charge, but the fact that they have access to this power and the fact that they use their privilege in this way is something that needs to be confronted.
Right. So I do want to know, well, from my experience of learning about these subjects, race, slavery, white supremacy, Black oppression, I don't recall anybody ever really specifically talking to me about the role of white women and what their role was in all of this history and what's going on. I feel like it's always been said, it's always been talked about generally, like white people in general, or it's always been talked about the white man. I want to know, why do you think that white women are sort of protected, like their role in what's been going on in the racism? Why does it seem like why has it been protected, in your opinion?
Well, I kind of talk about this in some of my classes when I talk about, I talk about in some of my classes the WKKK, which is the Women's Auxiliary Organization of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Because there was this WKKK, and they did a lot of it would not have been uncommon for a woman in the South to go to church on the Sunday and then go to her women's Klan meeting. Totally normal part of society. And when I talk about that, one of the things I talk about is you have these women in the Klan, but you also have the actual Klan, which is a fraternal organization. So it's still this male dominated organization, and women end up there kind of being there to support it. They're not really given power, but they're allowed to be engaged.
Like the cheerleaders.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think, when we study the WKKK or the KKK, what gets wrapped up a lot in those conversations is white men telling white women, you must be protected. You are an object to be protected. You are fragile. You are pure. You are a mother, and our job as white men is to protect you. Mm-hmm. Now, who's out there to hurt you? Primarily Black men. They want to hurt you. They want to rape you. They want to kill you. Now, mind you, right, if we look at the women who are most vulnerable, the reality is Black women are most vulnerable, especially in this period, right? It's not very hard to look and see, what white men were doing to Black women. That's probably why they had fears about what Black men were going to do to white women, because those are things they were doing themselves. And, I think white women have to stop thinking of themselves as victims. They have to stop thinking of themselves as just people who are, on the sidelines, and kind of face the reality of the power that they have, for good or for bad, because that power could be used for good, if we can be honest with ourselves.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to talk about the women's suffrage movement for just a little bit. So basically, we know that this was about women trying to fight for their right to vote, and white women were really trying to get a chance to vote, and they kind of teamed up with Black people and Black women, to try to fight for their right to vote, essentially. But then the law came for all men to be able to vote, including Black men. White women were not happy about that. Like, how are you going to let Black people or Black men be able to vote before we can? And they kind of turned their backs on Black people altogether. And I kind of just want to equate that to, I guess, the last election where white women kind of chose their race over their gender to vote for a man that Trump that has said comments about women in general that were not for us, essentially, for women. Mm-hmm. So I kind of just want to equate that, and I kind of want to ask you also, what do you predict is going to happen this upcoming election, seeing how everything's going?
Well, I would say about suffrage, you're 100% right. We see before the end of slavery, we do see these white women who become suffragettes. Prior to the end of the Civil War, they were for abolition. Mm-hmm. They were women who were oh, Black people should not be enslaved. And then as soon as Black men got the right to vote, they were oh my God, what? Because, you see them as they still centered themselves, they were still centering themselves, even in saying oh, we think that Black people should not be enslaved. Mm-hmm. But also we're still number one, right? We're still up here in society because of our whiteness. And then after Black men get the right to vote, allegedly, right, there's going to be a lot of things that prevent Black men from voting because of systems in the South that continue racism. We see these same white women not just kick Black women out of the suffrage movement, but actively use language that puts Black lives in danger. Mm-hmm. Women like Susan B. Anthony are going to say things you have basically they're going to be telling white men, politicians, like, by giving Black men the right to vote and keeping the right to vote from us as white women, you are putting us in danger.
Mm-hmm.
Now Black men can kill us, rape us, hurt us. I mean, the language they use is not just divesting from an integrated suffragette movement. It is actively like a language that can put Black people in harm's way. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like even worse. And, you know, I don't know, today I think that we still see a lot of those same themes of like me first. And oftentimes me first for white women is like the whiteness first before being a woman first.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, intersectionality is complicated, but they're just, you know, a poll just came out, like 49% of white voters, both men and women, are still saying they're going to vote for Donald Trump. You know, so if that's where we are today in 2020, after everything we've seen, after everything we've heard, you know, I don't know. I think that's why I hope like a course like this or a book like this maybe can like help move that needle a little bit, because what that tells me is that white women are still not engaged in learning about history. They're still not engaged in understanding their privilege. They're still not engaged in, you know, seeing Black women as part of the same, you know, womanhood that they are a part of.
And I also want to talk about another subject I saw that you were going to be talking about in the class. I know you said you were going to be talking about abortion. I saw that on one of your slides. So I kind of want to talk about that because I feel like it can be confusing trying to decide or see whether the abortion movement was actually for everyone or for all women or not. I know that I think Margaret Sanger, she was the one that created Planned Parenthood. She coined the term birth control. People, I've seen too many articles where some are calling her racist and some are not. Some people are saying that she created Planned Parenthood to eradicate the Black race, while other people are saying, well, not really, she was actually for us. Martin Luther King got the humanitarian award from her, and I think eugenics, people say that she used that more in her speech, and even though that's not good, that isn't necessarily racism. So can you just kind of clear that up, like on whether what you think or what you've learned for people, so that way they don't get confused?
I will say, like, you know, everyone's doing their best guess, right? Because we don't know Margaret Sanger's heart or mind. You know, we can look at the things she said and the things that she did and make our best guesses. My best guess from reading what she did and what she said is that she was a segregationist. You know, she was a person who had racism, you know, in her, it was a part of her. You know, like, I do believe that she, you know, thought white people and Black people probably existed in different spaces, and that was okay. She also was, you know, believed in eugenics. Now, there's a lot to eugenics. Eugenics was a huge field of study that was considered a completely legitimate field of study at the time that she was working. I don't see her embracing the type of eugenics policies that were specifically anti-Black. I see her being interested in it as a field. But when we look at the things that she said, the people who she worked with, I do not think we see a woman who is out to destroy a Black community. I think we see a woman who genuinely believed that every single woman deserved to make choices about her own body, which is why she would go give a speech to Black communities. She would work with Black leaders. And in one instance, she gave a speech to like a women's auxiliary of the KKK. Like, if she saw a woman, she wanted them to know about birth control, and she wanted them to be able to make these decisions about their lives. You know, Planned Parenthood condemns the fact that she gave this speech to this auxiliary of the KKK. I think it's important to be honest about everything she did, though, if we're going to talk about her. But I think the through line, when you see who she worked with and the things that she consistently said, it was everyone should have access to birth control because every woman's life will be better if they can make this decision for themselves. And she wanted women to be able to make decisions for themselves and for their lives that were not simply based on, well, I got pregnant, now I have no options. There's also a lot of quotes attributed to Margaret Sanger that she didn't actually say. There's a lot of misinformation about the things that she said. There's that statistic, people say that there are more Planned Parenthoods in Black communities, and that's specifically to, you know, stop Black communities from growing. that statistic is not true either. The majority of Planned Parenthoods are in white communities. The demographics of Planned Parenthood kind of reflect our demographics as a country. There doesn't seem to be a preponderance of them in Black communities. But that being said as well, you know, because of the nature of Planned Parenthood, oftentimes I think in Black communities, there is more access to a Planned Parenthood than other kind of healthcare services, you know, and that's an issue we need to talk about as well. Yeah. Why is that? Exactly. That's not because of Margaret Sanger. That's because we're a broken country in many ways. So I think it's an incredibly nuanced conversation. And, you know, I certainly won't sit here and say like Margaret Sanger was the best and she, you know, did everything right. But I also don't think that she was kind of a monster who was out to hurt the Black community. I think she was a woman struggling to get this message out to anyone who would listen. But also, again, you know, she herself had, you know, her own probably issues with how she saw, you know, non-white communities or communities of color as well. So neither a saint nor a monster. You know, I'm not sure exactly
what to call it. Yeah. And I do want to talk about the flip side of that, the anti-abortion movement. So I did kind of read some stuff where they were saying that that was actually rooted in racism and kind of had like a racial agenda behind it, and that it kind of just started due to people wanting to keep schools segregated, and they kind of had to find a problem to kind of move their agenda, essentially. Would you say that's true as well?
I would say the anti-abortion movement is in many ways linked to the rise of the religious right. And if we look at how politics are evolving in American history at that point, what we see is a Republican Party that realizes they're losing power, right? I mean, in many points in American history, I think Republican Party, you can't just say Republican, right? Because we have Democrats and Republicans, and there's an ideological switch, and they become the opposite of what they were, you know, during the Civil War era. But specifically in the modern era, the Republican Party, like they see that they're kind of losing supporters, and they have to figure out how to reconfigure, right? How do we keep voters on our side? Excuse me. And one of the things we see is that they start to embrace this anti-abortion, pro-life position. That is not something that the Republican Party has embraced from the beginning of time. That is not something that Christians have embraced from the beginning of time. Like today, I think specifically, especially if we're talking about like white Christian communities, we have this assumption like, well, obviously they're anti-abortion. But the fact that that's where we are today is born out of a specific strategy used by Republicans to get the religious right to be Republican voters forever, because they very correctly assumed that, you know, abortion would be the wedge issue that would keep people voting Republican no matter what, right? Wedge issues are when you have an issue that is so personal to a voter that no matter what else the party is doing, they're going to be like, but that's the thing that matters the most. And speaking about white women who vote for Trump, I cannot tell you how many white women, you know, I personally know who are like, I hate him, but he's going to sign a Supreme Court justice who's going to be anti-abortion. So no matter what else is going on, exactly. So this tactic was used and continues to be used incredibly effectively to keep people voting Republican, even people who hate Trump, even people who think that he is a bad president and perhaps even a bad person. Because of that anti-abortion issue, they will fall in line and continue to vote for him.
That's what I wanted to ask, yeah. Because I know there's like some stuff going on right now where, well, really, I think as of last month in Florida, they even put like more restrictions on getting abortions. So I think the latest restriction was that underage girls would not be able to get it without the approval of their parents. So that's what I really wanted to know is like, do you think there's like a hidden agenda with them like putting more restrictions on it? Is that Trump's way of trying to keep getting himself like a second term, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. If you don't know history, then they can be fooled, right? And if you don't know history and you think like Christians have always been anti-abortion and Christians have always voted Republican, then you like are like, well, yeah, this is just how it is. This is just how it's always been. But the truth is it's not. It hasn't always been that way. We can look back you know, to the 1950s, 1960s and see like white Christian churches are not, you know, completely uniformly anti-abortion. Like that's a fairly like modern idea that these two ideas are married together, but it's incredibly effective in keeping a large group of people voting Republican because they're like, well, these things just go hand in hand. But if you knew history, you might know that they don't have to, and they haven't always. And the reason that they do comes from a specific political agenda. Oh, even if we talk about Roe versus Wade, right? Roe versus Wade is, you know, the Supreme Court case. Sorry, I'm like looking over your shoulder at a note that I,
No
that
problem.
I wanted to make sure to say this, like, to challenge abortion. And the woman in that Supreme Court case, like after she died, it came out that she never believed the anti-abortion stance that she took, that she was in fact paid in order to just be a person. Yeah, and like, I'm sorry, like I wish I just like Googled it right now because my mind's a little scattered and I should have brought my note closer. But Roe versus Wade, I mean, that Supreme Court decision is a definitive decision in American history. And what we now know is like the challenge to abortion was essentially bought and paid for by Republicans who wanted to you know, challenge this notion in order to put out the message like, hey, if you want to be, you know, anti-abortion, you have to be with Republicans. You know, no matter what other issues are on the table, no matter what it is, you got to vote for us because of this one issue. And that issue was born out of an agenda, a literal agenda where a white woman was paid to say all these things that she didn't believe. And we don't find out about this until after, you know, she's dead. Would have been helpful to know it earlier, probably. Yeah. But, you know, if we're talking about agenda, I mean, these are clear agendas.
Since you are a professor at FSU, I did want to ask you, what are your thoughts on the call of the removal of the Epps statue and also the Doak Campbell name from the stadium?
Sure. Number one, I don't think anyone is owed a statue or owed a memorial of their name forever. So someone like Doak Campbell, you know, he was a segregationist. Florida State during the 60s was called the Berkeley of the South. The students at Florida State were some of the most active participants in the civil rights movement in Florida, on the East Coast. FAMU students start the civil rights movement in Tallahassee, our bus boycotts in Tallahassee. FAMU students were targeted by the governor of Florida, who wanted to say, in order to malign them, said that, you know, male students at FAMU were gay and therefore they should be discredited. Wow. You know, this information the Florida, like the state of Florida put out to discredit them, right? So we have this incredibly rich history in Florida, in Tallahassee specifically, of student-led civil rights activists. And then we have a stadium which is named after a segregationist. You know, like that doesn't make sense to me. Tallahassee has like a rich history of protest for equality. So why are we naming, you know, this is a really important structure in Tallahassee. Football is incredibly important to Tallahassee. Businesses in Tallahassee thrive on a good football season. So if our community is one that has a rich history of social activism, political activism against segregation, why are we naming this after someone who is pro segregation? So to me, it's like, this just doesn't make sense. Why are we remembering this person who was in the wrong side of history? There are so many people that the stadium could be named after that actually celebrates the fact that students in Tallahassee were on the right side of history. And for the Epps statue, you know, to me, there's no justification for there to be an Epps statue or an Epps Hall on campus, right? Because Epps Hall is the criminology building. And two things about Epps. Number one, he was an enslaver. Being an enslaver is not an innocuous thing to be. I noticed there was like a back and forth on a message board for I think the Tallahassee Democrat, where someone said like, you know, Epps, there shouldn't be a statue of Epps because he was an enslaver. And someone was like, well, what atrocities did he commit? And the person was like, he owned human beings, right? Like that should be enough. If you were an enslaver, you participated directly, if not literally with your own hands, in a system of oppression, violence, the worst part of American history. You were upholding that. Not to mention, he was also involved on some level with slave catchers because of his position in Florida, like in Tallahassee. So he is complicit in the oppression of slavery on multiple levels. Second to that, he is not a founder of Florida State. The justification to put the statue up in the 90s was that he was a founder of Florida State. So students have pushed back on having the statue a number of times throughout Florida State's history.
Yep.
Right? In 2016, there was a vote. The student body voted to keep the statue. Now, that vote would not have kept it or removed it. It was just kind of like, what do people think? The students were not empowered to do anything, but it was, what do you think? They decided to keep it. In 2017, students start to talk about it again and ask for its removal. President Thrasher puts together essentially a task force of professors, of people who are experts in this area, and says, research EPS. What is the story here? And then make a recommendation to me. So the task force does the work, and they recommend that the EPS statue be removed. And they say, we're not saying he should be removed based solely on the fact that he was an enslaver. Based on the research we've done, what we have discovered is he was not a founder of Florida State. He was a politician, and when the state was considering building a seminary in Tallahassee, he was an advocate of it. He was not on the board. He was not a founder of that seminary. He was not involved in any way, except that he was a politician who supported it. So that seminary is established. That seminary becomes eventually an all-girls school. That all-girls school eventually becomes Florida State. Nowhere in there is Francis Epps a founder of Florida State. And in fact, when the committee found this out, the president who was the president of Florida State when that statue went up, Sandy Dalembert, also rest in peace, Sandy Dalembert, he admitted in 2017 that they were right and that he had not done his research. And he said he regretted supporting the statue going up because he had not done the research. So the committee said he was an enslaver. He was not a founder of the college. We recommend to remove the statue. What happens? The statue is removed. They come at night, they remove the statue. Later that year, when students go home for the summer, maybe a week, maybe days after students go home for the summer, the statue comes back. And now, right. Now instead of being placed in front of Ruby Diamond, it's right behind Epps. So you could still, it's still within, throwing distance of where it was, no longer at the front of campus, but there it is. And so now here we are in the same place. And, from what I understand, because there are students who have been working to get an audience with President Thrasher to have this conversation with him. And from what they have said, he has said, no, I'm not going to remove it. I helped build the new Black Student Union. Isn't that enough? And to me, it's like putting that task force together and then completely not following their recommendation. Now he's saying he's putting another task force together. I'm like, well, I don't know that the first one was done, sincerely, because the recommendation they gave you was completely ignored. There's also, the Epps family is upset about it. They want to keep the statue up. Sorry. Oh, and the other thing is the family said if the statue, from what I understand, if the statue is removed, that they want their land back because it has been believed that the Epps family donated land that Florida State was built on. But we also know now that that's not true either. There is not this like land that they donated for the university to be built on that they can take back. So to me, the fact that it's there is in service of a false history. Removing statues is not removing history. People learn history from books, from classes, sometimes even from movies. There's not a lot of people walking around this country who learned history from seeing statues. And the investment in keeping statues up simply because they were created, that's not a good argument, especially when the statues are in service of a history that's not true. He was not a founder. He was an enslaver. Why is it up? what is the argument to keep it up other than, well, it's always been there.
Yeah.
And that's not good enough for me.
And to really just ignore your students.
Yeah. And also, because I guess the Epps family feels that they have a right to have their ancestor memorialized on campus, which again, maybe it's because none of my ancestors have statues, but I don't understand that that feeling of entitlement to have a statue of your ancestor anywhere. I don't understand that as a person. But yeah, I say change the name, remove the statue, change Epps Hall. I just don't see any valid reason to keep them as they are.
Yeah. Okay, so for my final question, I do want to ask you to kind of maybe suggest to my audience some type of literature, books to read, or even movies where we can kind of, well, I don't even think there's that many movies, but maybe just books or literature to read to kind of like get a better understanding of white women who weaponize their whiteness and just getting to know that a little bit more. Because like I said earlier, I was never really taught their role specifically in racism. So I feel like it's a very interesting topic, and I do commend you for coming up with that. Well, you and your partner for coming up with that idea. And so, do you have any suggestions for us on how we can educate ourselves more?
You know, one of the books that I've recommended a lot lately is a book called White Rage by Carol Anderson. And Carol Anderson is a professor and a writer. And White Rage is a book about the ways in which white communities have perpetrated violence against Black communities throughout the history of our country. And she literally starts at Reconstruction, so right after the Civil War, and kind of goes up through, the war on drugs into the 80s, 90s. And she really shows the ways in which white communities have, systematically made decisions that disadvantage Black communities, and have done so in a way that it's actually, violent towards Black communities. One of, to me, the most illuminating chapters is actually the one where she talks about Brown versus Board of Education, because you see white communities being so upset at the idea of Black students and white students sitting in the same classroom together that they would rather lose funding. They would rather actually pay, essentially like pay money to the federal government, and they would rather be fined and keep their education segregated than integrate. So what they do is actually compromise education, right? This is a thing that supposedly we care about as Americans, education. And we see these white communities going, we would rather have worse education, fewer resources. I mean, after Little Rock, the Little Rock 9 attempt to integrate, after that year, that district shuts down all public schools. There's literally no schools for anyone to go to because the white communities there would rather there be no education than have Black students and white students sit next to each other. And Carol Anderson shows this like very systematically through looking through a lot of court cases to show the ways in which white supremacy is valued over education, right? And she also links it to, let's look today. Where is America doing compared to the rest of the world in education? It's not great. We're not towards the, we're not near the top. And all of those things have to do with our history, in part compromising education in service of white supremacy. Like we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We'd rather uphold white supremacy than educate our children. So White Rage by Carol Anderson, to me, is an excellent book. There's also a documentary on Amazon right now called White Savior. And that really explores ways in which whiteness is used in Christianity, and the way that like in American Christianity, whiteness is like not that Christianity is inherently racist, but that Christians in America have used racism within their religion. And that's a fascinating documentary as well. So I would say
I'm going to watch that.
It is excellent. And it also talks a lot about indigenous communities and how they were destroyed, by colonizers who came in and, converted them or attempted to convert them, excuse me. So I would recommend White Rage to anyone. I think it's accessible too. I don't think you have to be an academic to get it, but it just gives you so many facts. It's not a really long book, but it is just packed with facts. For more academic books, there's also a book called Soul by Soul by Johnson. Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper is a fantastic book. Brittany Cooper's fantastic as well. Good follow, like on social media as well. I don't know, there's probably a lot of books. I could probably sit down and make a list, but White Rage, Soul by Soul, Eloquent Rage, and that White Savior documentary, those are probably good places to start.
Okay, awesome. And thank you so much for joining me for this episode. This was a very impactful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you again very much for having me. Hopefully I was not too long-winded. I tend
No,
to.
no problem. And thank you all for joining me for another episode of the Hershee Way. And I will see you all next time. Bye.